Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is Sadie Hagberg with New Additions Consulting, and I will be providing the technical assistance for the webinar. If you require any technical assistance during the webinar, please email me at shagberg@newadditions.net. My information is also available in the discussion notes pod. You can find a downloadable version of today's slides and other documents in the presentation files pod on the right-hand side of the screen. Please use the chat pod to ask questions at any time. All questions will be collected and addressed at the end of the presentation during the Q&A period. The audio has been globally muted to avoid background noise. The audio is available either through the Adobe platform or the dial-in phone number. So if you're listening on the phone while viewing the presentation through your computer, I recommend that you mute your computer speakers to avoid hearing an echo. Please do not place this call on hold. If you need to step away, please disconnect and rejoin as needed. Entry and exit tones have been disabled, so no one will hear you exit or enter the call. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Department of Education's website for future viewing. With that, I will hand it over to Donald Peasley with the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education.
Thank you, Sadie. I'd like to welcome everyone to this, our third in the series of webinars on inclusion of students in assessment, both students with disabilities and English learners, and in today's session in particular on English learners with disabilities. We've been really pleased with the participation in the webinars over the last 2 months, and we're very thankful that our partners at the National Center for Educational Outcomes have been able to put together these three important topics and set of information that we think is pretty timely to people in state departments of education. My job today is to introduce us and provide an overview of the agenda for today's session, and then hand it over to Christy from NCEO, and then you won't hear department staff the rest of today because we'll be listening to the experts that are on the docket here. So again, my name is Don Peasley. My colleague Deborah Spitz has assisted in pulling these webinars together, and we're going to start with a brief overview of the assessment peer review that's offered by the department, and talk about some ways it intersects both English learners and specifically English learners with disabilities. Then Christy Liu from NCEO will talk about principles and guidelines for assessing English learners with disabilities, and she'll be highlighting an NCEO publication. We're going to hear from state and two assessment consortia talking about assessment participation and accessibility, accommodations, decisions for English learners with disabilities. So we'll be joined by Sonia Phillips and Mamie Itamochi from the West Virginia Department of Education, and Kat Still and Jennifer Dean. Kat's with the ELPA 21 assessments. Jennifer's from the Iowa Department of Education. And finally, Lorene Christensen and Jennifer Voorhees from the WIDA ELP Assessment Consortium. And then Christy's got a brief wrap-up for us. Throughout the session, please record any questions you have in the chat box. We'll be breaking the presentation in a few different places to deal with questions as they come up. And without further ado, I'm just going to move into the first part of our session today. And I think from the department's perspective, we want to give everyone a background on where assessment peer review has been in the last 5 years now, since the assessment peer review was reinstituted under new guidance in 2016. In 2016, we peer-reviewed 38 states, primarily their reading and mathematics assessments. In 2017, we had 11 more states. And then in 2018, we had 42 states. And by 2018, we had peer-reviewed assessments in all of the states in DC and Puerto Rico. In 2019, we peer-reviewed the English language proficiency assessments in 48 states, and 10 of those states were lucky enough to also have their academic assessments peer-reviewed, probably on a resubmission. And then in this year, we've completed peer reviews in about 35 states. So it's a pretty major activity on behalf of our team in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, and we know that it's a major effort in state departments of education and their assessment offices. And we think that over time, it has worked to push improvement in state assessment systems. So I mentioned there are several places specifically in the peer review process that touch English learners and English learners with disabilities. We obviously, in our assessment peer review, we have 30 specific criteria known as critical elements. Critical element 5.2 deals specifically with the participation of English learners in the state's academic content assessments and looks at the state's guidance on the selection of linguistic accommodations for students in the academic assessments. Critical element 5.3 deals with accommodations in assessment and focuses on how the state makes available appropriate accommodations and ensures that the assessments are accessible to students with disabilities and English learners, including those English learners with disabilities. And this requires that the state provide guidance on the selection of appropriate allowable accommodations. And I'm kind of cherry picking key phrases out of our critical elements here. Hopefully it will set the stage in some of the content that you're going to hear from our presenters later today. And really one of the final critical elements that deals with English learners and English learners with disabilities is critical element 5.4, which deals with the monitoring of test administration for special populations. And it requires that the state monitor test administration to ensure that the appropriate assessments with or without accommodations are selected for all students with disabilities and English learners so that they're appropriately included in assessments. And it requires the states to demonstrate monitoring of the fidelity of assessment accommodation administration. So just a couple of high points on all of those English language proficiency assessment peer reviews that I talked about from 2019. We had 36 states that are members of the WIDA Assessment Consortium. Those states are listed there. And another 8 states that are members of the ELPA 21 Assessment Consortium. Those states are listed there. And then 5 individual states that operate their own English language proficiency assessment. Were all peer-reviewed in the winter of 2019, and all of those feedback letters that those states received can be found at the web link there. And that's a newer page that we've just published, and it has searchable filters. So if you search under assessment peer review in either 2019 or 2020, you'll find those states' feedback letters there. And we just wanted to take a moment to touch on some things that the peer reviews found and were communicated with states. And first, about alternate ELP assessments, there were many states that didn't submit evidence for their alt-ELPAs. But those states were all asked to submit evidence of their timelines to implement alt-ELPAs and then to submit that evidence for peer review. But there were about 24 states that did submit evidence for their alt-ELPA, and those states were using the alt-access assessment. And also on the topic of alt-ELPAs, a year ago at this time, the department, through its competitive grants for state assessments program, awarded a grant to the state of Iowa to develop an alt-ELPA through the ELPA 21 consortium, and also awarded a grant to the state of Minnesota to develop, really redesign and update the alt-access assessment through the WIDA assessment consortium. And we want to highlight a few things from our peer review of the ELP assessments in states. And we found many states had findings in the areas of critical elements that are really pursuant to things that the state does, not things that a vendor does. And in particular, those were in the areas of testing administration, the training about test administration, test security, and monitoring. And those were true both in consortium states and in some of our non-consortium states. So in particular, the state responsibilities regarding monitoring were kind of cross-cutting issues that were identified. So we just wanted to take a few moments to touch on some points, and hopefully we're foreshadowing a little bit of the content you're about to see in the remainder of today's session. So with that, and so I wanted to conclude, we think that these particular items are pretty straightforward for states to address. It's making clear to districts that ELP assessments are included in state monitoring guidance, and states having clear policies for scoring domain exception students. And we found that states had the systems to score domain exemption students, but the policy as to what exactly was the practice in a state. There may be 2 or 3 methods of approaching a domain exception situation, and we were unclear in reviewing the state's evidence what exactly, if there's 3 models, which model was being implemented. And so those things we thought were pretty straightforward for states to be able to build and improve upon in their administration of ELP assessments. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christy, and she's going to talk about the featured resource for today's session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Christy Liu from the National Center on Educational Outcomes. I'm the Assistant Director. NCO is a co-sponsor of this webinar with the department, and we're grateful for the opportunity to connect with you all. If you don't happen to know about NCO, we're a U.S. Department of Education funded technical assistance center, and our job is to provide support for states around the inclusion of students from special populations, that's students with disabilities, English learners with disabilities, in large-scale assessments and accountability. So we provide resources and support for states like the resource I'm just going to highlight for you today, and like this webinar. So the resource we have today is an update of an older report that we pulled out and thought was still really relevant for the discussion we're having now. So it was originally published in 2013 by the IVARED project, and now it's published through NCEO, republished with a new introduction that's updated, but the principles and guidelines remain the same. It's called Updated Assessment Principles and Guidelines for English Learners with Disabilities. And it's available through the presentation files and also on the NCEO website. If you look under our products, you can either click on that link or look under products for 2020 and find it there. And this report, it's really consistent with the standards for educational and psychological testing published by the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education. The report presents 5 core principles of valid assessments for English learners with disabilities, and these were developed through a process I'll describe in a little bit with a panel of experts, national experts. They present a comprehensive and cohesive vision of ways to appropriately include English learners with disabilities in large-scale assessment systems and to make sure the results are valid indicators of students' knowledge and skills. So in the report, you will see a brief rationale for each principle, the list of principles, then a rationale, and then some specific guidelines underneath each principle that reflect kind of steps toward achieving the goal in the principle. And I can't provide you with details on all of those principles and guidelines today because there are too many to present here, but I'll give you an overview and then you can go check out the report for more detail. At the end of the report, there's also a description of the process we used with experts to generate the principles and guidelines. The key audiences we think for this report are you, state education agency staff, especially if you're leadership in assessment, special education, English learners, or if you're someone who uses large-scale assessment results. We also think that the report is a good resource for technical advisory committees, for testing contractors who work on large-scale assessments, and for district leaders who work on district assessment systems as well. We believe that the principles and guidelines are really applicable to general state and district assessments, to alternate assessments, and to state English proficiency assessments, both regular and alternate. So really relevant to what we're talking about today. To develop them, we had a panel of 11 national experts in English learner education, special education, and assessment who participated in an online Delphi process, which is kind of an online brainstorming and then repeated rounds of ranking and weighting options. So they brainstorm a list of things they think are good principles for assessing English learners with disabilities, and then they go back in and weight them and discuss them and come up with a final list. If you go to the full report, you can see a list of the experts who are involved. So I'll just give you a little overview of the 5 principles these experts identified. The first one is that content standards are the same for all students. The people involved in the standards development should be those who know the students best. The standards are accessible to all students, especially English learners with disabilities. And educators get ongoing professional development and support in the standards. Those are some of the guidelines that address this principle. Principle 2 is that test and item development include a focus on access to the content free from bias without changing the construct being measured. And guidelines under this principle really address understanding students who take the assessment, so characteristics of English learners with disabilities, how they show their knowledge and skill. Involving people with relevant expertise in test and item development, applying universal design for learning principles, knowing how accessibility features and accommodations affect valid scores for English learners. Some of these may make items less accessible instead of more accessible. And planning for accessibility features and accommodations from the beginning of test development. And then including English learners with disabilities in item tryouts and field tests. And principle 3 Assessment participation decisions are made on an individual student basis. That's really important, by an informed IEP team. The guidelines under this one really reflect that decisions are made by an informed team. And for students with disabilities who have an IEP, it's fairly standard practice, but for English learners, oftentimes we find that decisions about assessment participation may be made by a single EL teacher. And so we're really promoting a vision here of team-based decision-making. And members of the team should be individuals with relevant expertise, special education, EL education, content area education, etc. So this team makes decisions about the needs of an individual student. And the team is trained on assessment decision-making so that they make similar decisions for students with similar characteristics, and also that the team uses a written policy to make decisions. Principle 4, accommodations for both English language proficiency and content assessments are assigned by an IEP team knowledgeable about the individual student's needs. Again, there you see IEP team and individual student, but what's different there is that it's talking about accommodations. Principle 3 was more about test participation. So guidelines under this principle address that it's a knowledgeable team, again, representing each of the areas that impact the student, that they assign accommodations that address both English proficiency and a student's disability needs, and that the team really knows the student and what will support that individual student the best. So again, we're emphasizing individual student decision-making, not group decision-making. We recommend that the team look at data on accommodations and develop written policies on accommodations for English learners with disabilities, and then also train decision makers on accommodations policies. And finally, Principle 5, reporting formats and content to support different uses of large-scale assessment data for different audiences. So this one is really to consider ways that public reporting of assessment data are useful to different audiences. We recommend disaggregating both participation and performance data for English learners with disabilities if there are enough students. And again, if there are enough students to look at that by English proficiency level in public reporting. To highlight districts and schools with exceptional performance and hold up models of what's working well for others to see. To provide guidance to teachers on how to interpret and use test scores appropriately, and to create different reporting formats for parents. So when you go to the report, you'll see something that looks like this. You'll see the principle at the top, and then you'll see a list of guidelines underneath, and then for each principle there's explanation of what it means, and for each guideline there's an explanation of what it means. And I won't go into all of that written text, but you see there the general format. Again, a key assumption of these principles and guidelines is that there is a team decision-making process in place both for what assessment students take and for the accessibility features and accommodations they receive. And in the report, we present the principles in the little circular graphic you see there. And we emphasize these principles really are a starting point for larger conversations like the one we're having today about appropriate and instruction and assessment for English learners with disabilities. They're not the ending point, they're the beginning point. And I think that as you hear each of our speakers present today, you will hear ways that they have really expanded upon some of these principles and put them into action. So before I turn it over to our next speaker, which is staff from the West Virginia Department of Education, we'll check in with Cheryl Lazarus here and see if we have any questions.
We got a comment, and the comment is to Principle 4, which is the one about accommodations. She would add that should include placement in the alternate English language proficiency assessment and should be consistent with placement in the alternate content assessment. Do you have any, anything additional that might be added to that comment or thoughts about it?
No, my first thought was when we originally developed these principles and guidelines, it was pre-alternate English proficiency assessment era. And so there are things that could be added to them. I'm sure more things you'll hear today in that topic area that aren't reflected here. So that's a good point to keep track of. Thank you.
And maybe just a more general question, and maybe it's for some of the upcoming presenters, is do guidelines, decision-making guidelines, should placement be consistent across the alternate content assessments and the alternate English language proficiency assessment? Would you anticipate that they would be?
That was a question for some of our presenters.
If you have thoughts about it, we may just hear that as the other presenters present. But you?
Yeah. My understanding is that there's some variability in how states might approach this. NCO is working on a larger document, not yet published, kind of relating to decision-making processes in this area. And since it's not finished yet, I can't share it, but one of the things we recommend in that document is that students who are taking the alternate assessment of English language arts or reading and math be the ones considered for an alternate English language proficiency assessment, but I know that there may be some variability in how states approach that. So if any of our state or consortium partners want to jump in here and say how you approach this, feel free to unmute yourselves.
And there's actually a very lively chat going related to this. One person says eligibility determinations should follow state guidelines. They shouldn't have a whole separate eligibility process. Another individual is agreeing. So this is definitely an area that states are thinking a lot about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that conversation going on in the chat. I think that unless we have more questions for right now, that conversation can continue to take place. And we could segue here into presentations from our state and assessment consortium partners, and maybe they'll address some of these topics as they present. So the first up in our presenters is staff from the West Virginia Department of Education. I'd like to welcome Sonia Phillips and Mami Itamochi.
Thank you. Okay, so let us just go ahead and introduce ourselves. I hope you guys can hear me. My name is Mami Itamochi with West Virginia Department of Education. And I have my colleagues here with me. Sonia, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, my name is Sonia Phillips, and I'm a coordinator in the Office of Assessment for alternate assessments as well as then accommodations. So I've been working with Mami and NCEO on this project, and I'm very excited to be able to present some of it to you.
Thank you. All right. So let's talk about this Improving Instruction project. Before I go into the goals, the project funding and partners, I just wanted to mention this is the 5-year National Professional Development Grant from the U.S. Department of Education, and we started this project from 2016. This is the collaboration between the National Center on Education Outcomes, NCEO, and West Virginia Department of Education. The improving instruction project goals improve West Virginia teachers' understanding of how to select, implement, and evaluate the use of instructional and assessment accessibility features and accommodations by students who are EL, including students who are EL with disability. Improve teachers' perceptions of their ability to instruct, to create supported learning opportunity in the classroom, improve academic outcomes for students who are English learners. And let's talk about this. What do we mean by accessible instruction and assessment? Developing or adapting lessons so that all students, including students who are English learners, can participate fully in classroom activities. And then keeping the standards and the lesson outcomes the same for English learners as for other students, while reducing the barriers for students who are English learners developing English skills. Providing individualized support called accommodations, especially in testing situations. Rationale. When English learners have the right accessibility features and accommodations to access instruction and assessment, the results are more likely to be valid and reliable. Understanding and aligning accessibility supports across instruction and assessment can be challenging for teachers. West Virginia has a very small but rapid growing population of EL who are geographically disparate. Some West Virginia teachers may live and work in isolated areas and may have difficulty attending in-person training. So again, West Virginia, I'm sure that every state has different challenging situation, but West Virginia is, has very small EL populations. But then again, you know, there are all those EL students are spread out throughout the West Virginia. We have about 2,000 EL students right now. Next, online professional development modules. So we do have two modules from this project, secondary and elementary general education teachers audience. This professional development module is very much scenario based, and then we have some actual sample student scenario and teachers. Each focuses on the one EL without a disability and has additional information on EL with disability. Full modules components. One is thinking about student needs. Two, making and implementing instructional support decisions. Three, making and implementing assessment support decisions. And number four, pulling it all together. Okay, so we do have one quick video that we want to share with you. Before we move on to that video, I would like to ask everybody to unmute your speaker so that you can listen to actual video. Thank you. Okay, so I am not sure that we are able to share the video right at this time. Okay, so I don't know if the video is going to work or not, so I'm going to go ahead move on to the next slide. But then we have some links at the end of the slides, or we can share that with you in the chat box. We do recommend for you guys to go to the NCEO website so that you can actually watch some of the video there too. Modules are available to anyone. So we do have these teachers training modules available in our D2L2 professional development website. But to anyone on the interested in this modules, you can go to the National Center on Educational Outcome website. And then this is the link here listed. Implementing accessible assessment. Decisions are collaborative among educators, parents, and students and start early. Decisions are individualized based on state accessibility and accommodations policies and the students' characteristics and learning needs. Planning for assessment should inform instruction. Some supports can be used in one setting, but not the other. Module provides 3 levels of planning accessibility for instruction: universal design, embedded English learner instructional strategies, and choosing appropriate individualized supports in the classroom. Ideally, students should have experience in the classroom using the supports they will use on state assessment. This is very important. When offering classroom supports, consider what students can and cannot use on state assessment. Aim for consistency. EL accessibility plan. This project created an EL accessibility plan that is downloadable and customizable for teams building. Sample on next page. So next few slides, you can see the sample for this plan. This plan is modeled in the videos as well. Educators use the plan to coordinate and document decisions about both accessible assessment and the instruction that precedes it, so that 2 things are planned simultaneously. All relevant stakeholders are part of the conversation and have access to that information. Step in filling out English learner accessibility decision-making form. So gather information on the student's characteristics and experiences. 2, identify appropriate accessibility features and accommodations for instruction. 3, do the same thing for assessment. And number 4, evaluate how well the accessibility features and accommodations work for the student. So let's look at the part of the sheet here. Step 1, gather student information, student characteristics. So this is the part of the accessibility sheet that we were talking about. So the first one is student assessment data, and then other information can be gathered in this document. Identify appropriate accessibility features and accommodations for instruction. So this is the part that step 2 you can fill out. Step 3, do the same thing for assessment. So this is the part for the assessment planning. Step 4, evaluate how well they work. When we are developing this module, we did the pilot, and then we have good size of university here close to our office. So Marshall University Professional Development course made it available for West Virginia teachers as a pilot 16-week hybrid class we did. That was back in 2018, designed for teachers in K-12 general education teachers. And then now we are putting this module into our D2L platform, and then live for West Virginia teachers. And then that has been available since 2020 February. To this date, we only have 15 teachers completed. Things have been a little different this year, so not very many people have gone through this, but we're hoping to have more teachers to go through this module. All right. Sonia.
Okay. Hi, this is Sonia Phillips, and thank you, Mommy. I do want to point out that we have probably about another 20 teachers who have started the modules and gone through various different points of it, but with this being unprecedented, they are at different levels of completing it. So hopefully as things maybe settle down, more can come back and finish it. So to help our committees be able to select accommodations for our state testing, Mommy and I have created, based on what tests they're going to take, whether if it's a grade 3 through 8 test, they take our West Virginia General Summative Assessment. So they would take the one on the left with the peach bar at the top. Or if they're an 11th grader, they would be taking our SAT school day assessment. So the accommodations that are available based on per test are listed here. And then the committees can help keep that in mind so that makes sure they're not selecting an accommodation that just isn't appropriate for that test. And then, of course, each of the committee members sign at the bottom indicating they agree with the decisions of the committee. And then once those decisions are made, they go into what's called our West Virginia Education Information System, or we call it lovingly WEVIS. We all have to have acronyms. And then they have various codes. So like PO1 is text-to-speech, excluding the ELA passages, and on down through. There are quite a few more accommodations than what you see here, but that's just a brief screenshot. So once they've done the plans that you just saw, it gets put into our WEVIS system, and then we take a download from WEVIS, and it gets inserted onto Scantron sheets. And each of our tests have a different Scantron sheet, and only those accommodations appropriate to that test are available to be coded. So let's say Sonia had an accommodation in order to take the SAT, I would add text-to-speech. So my demographic information would have been pre-populated up there at the top, and then where it's PO1, it would have the dot filled in. And then these forms are distributed to the districts and then to the teachers who's going to administer me the test. So once I've completed the test, the teacher then finds my sheet and then says, yes, Sonia was administered this accommodation for this test. So they fill in the right bubble, and then they sign the bottom, and they send them back to the State Department where we collect them. So here's a bit larger of a screenshot so you can see what they look like a little bit closer up. Then once we get all of these back from the district, we send them off to Scantron, who so wonderfully scans these for us, and we get an absolutely enormous file back from them. For every student who has taken one of our state tests who's had an accommodation, whether it's an EL accommodation, accommodation from an IEP, or a 504, they're going to have one of these. So we get this file back from Scantron, and we are able to then sort based on and take a look at that data and see if there's maybe some training issues, or to look at see what are some trends that have been occurring over the year over accommodation uses. On the back of these are the directions on how to complete these forms, so that way if the teachers just kind of need a quick refresher, not only are they trained every year, but then the directions on the back will provide a quick refresher on what they need to do with it. So this is what we currently are using, this paper form, which is a step up from what it used to be. It used to be literally, pages that had been cut apart with a pair of scissors with Sonia's accommodation, and then down below me would be, somebody else's accommodations, and those would be sent to the district and then literally cut apart by scissors, and so you had all these little teeth sliding pieces of paper around. So Scantron sheets are an amazing step up. However, our next iteration is going to be using our WEVIS program. So when a teacher logs in to WEVIS, when they log in with their specific code, they will be able to go in and select what test they're going to administer. So they would just go to the drop-down menu for which test they would be administering. They would enter at the top the student's WEVIS number. Every student in West Virginia has their own WEVIS code. Click on Find Student. And then the codes that are entered in the system per this child's plan are going to be listed right here. And then the teacher will be able to click yes or no, were these accommodations provided, and then click Save. And it will then just be loaded right back into the system. So we won't have these forms going back and forth, and we won't get this enormous file then that has to be uploaded by our data people, and then they get to work on massaging it and trying to understand and pull out the lessons that we need from the very large data file. So we are hoping that with our ELPA assessments this winter and spring, that maybe we could pilot this with some of the districts, and then we'll see what this spring's assessment picture holds and go from there. So that is all we have from West Virginia. That's our contact information for myself and Mommy. If you guys have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
I don't see any questions in the chat box related to your presentation, but I know I learned a lot. There are some comments continuing about what decision making related to participation of English learners with disabilities. So if you're not watching the chat box, you might want to take a look at that. If anyone has any questions for Sonia and Mommy, please enter them and we'll get to them at the next time we take questions.
All right, this is Christy again. Thank you, Mommy and Sonia. Our next group of presenters are from ILPA 21 and the Iowa Department of Education. Kat Still and Jennifer Dunn, take it away.
Thanks, Christy, and thank you for the opportunity to present today, Dawn. I'm Catherine Still. I'm the Executive Director of ILPA 21 at CRESS. I'm joined today by Jennifer Den, the Alternate Assessment Specialist at the Iowa Department of Education. Today we're going to share our recommendations for making decisions related to inclusivity, accessibility, and accommodations for English learners with disabilities. So I'll share some factors to consider in making decisions about ELP assessment, participation, and implementing supports, as well as practical considerations for testing English learners with disabilities. Jennifer will then describe how identification process works in Iowa, and then I'll return briefly to describe the alternate assessment of English language proficiency that's being developed by Iowa in partnership with CRESS and ILPA 21. So first we'll look at ELP assessment participation and support. English learners are identified through a two-step process that begins with a home language usage survey, and you're probably familiar with this process. Just to briefly cover it, the survey is administered to any family enrolling a new student. It asks about the presence of a language other than English in the home. So based on these survey responses, students are then administered an English language screener. That screener determines if a student's needs around language development would benefit from additional EL support. And this screener is administered often prior to any IEP meeting happening for this new student. Then students who are labeled English learners take an annual summative ELP assessment, English language proficiency assessment, to demonstrate their growth. Students who meet the grade level benchmarks are then exited from EL services and the EL label is changed. Alternate assessments of English language proficiency are allowed and encouraged. Two are currently under development. I'll tell you more about ours at the end of this presentation. So that's how we determine participation in English language assessments. When we have English learners with disabilities, as you probably know, the language needs and the disability deserve and need additional attention to these factors. A language issue can appear as or mask a disability, and vice versa. The opposite can also be true. So this offers an opportunity for professionals who support English learners and students with disabilities to collaborate on IEPs and other decision making for these students. This is a critical collaboration that best supports students. So an IEP team that includes an English learner specialist is critical to best supporting English learners with disabilities. The IEP team considers the student's language, disability, and the intersection of the two, and then determines appropriate support for the student. This support carries over from the classroom to the ELP and content assessment. Classroom support and accommodations should be matched on ELP and content assessments, and our technology today makes this very, very possible. Jennifer is going to talk to you in a few minutes about how these determinations are made in Iowa so that you can see a state walk through this process. First, I'm going to share with you a few practical considerations as you think about English learners with disabilities and assessment. So one of the key components that we recommend is allowing students to become familiar with the testing experience itself. And some of these may seem like obvious factors, but they are often overlooked and they can make a critical difference in a student's testing outcomes and testing experience. So we recommend that we let students take the practice test multiple times as preparation for the English language proficiency assessments, whether it's the regular or the alternate ELP assessment. And this would also be true for content assessments. Students' accommodations and supports can be pre-programmed into the testing engine so that the student can take a practice test that feels just like the real thing. And these testing accommodations, of course, should match the student's instructional accommodations. Additionally, there are ways to prepare the student for testing day thoughtfully. Letting them practice on the device or a similar device to the one that they'll use during the test is a way to comfort them and give them additional support. So for example, if they'll be testing on a laptop, but they use maybe an iPad in class, let them go ahead and practice the test on that laptop. Let them walk through that testing interface so they know what to expect. With us, it's built into the ALPA 21 practice test, so the students know how to navigate the test in addition to answering the questions. Each time you let them practice, confirm that that student testing profile matches their IEP. We certainly don't want students to see any new accommodations on testing day. One more thing to consider, and we all know this, don't make a big deal out of testing day. We tell students to do their best. We reassure them that they're prepared, and we let them know that testing day is just like any other regular school day, and they've got this. With students who have with students who are learning English and are maybe experiencing a disability, the anxiety may be even higher around testing circumstances, so we want to do everything that we can to comfort them. There are some additional ways to give them comfort, such as giving them a full testing day dry run that is the same length as the test and in the same location as the test. You can allow a familiar presence in the testing room, someone who's TA trained that the student knows really well. This can be comforting for students and let them overcome, for example, shyness about speaking on the English language proficiency test. In one of our ALPA 21 states, there's an accommodation called Comforting Presence. This person's familiar with the students and can help manage stress and triggers and can help anticipate when the student needs breaks. So that's an example of yet another way to go ahead and support their physical comfort while students are taking tests. And then additionally, we recommend that states reevaluate your accommodations programs as necessary. We at ALPA 21 evaluate ours at least annually, and then we do ad hoc review when new accommodations come up. Most of these accommodations come up from schools and get escalated to a state for a decision about whether the accommodation is allowable. And we work with the states to review those new accommodations. Familiar Listener is an accommodation that we implemented this year. It allows students to have their speech transcribed by a paraprofessional familiar with their speaking. This transcription is then sent along with the speech sample to the scoring vendor. They're paired up at the scoring center, and both are used to score the student's speech. This is an accommodation that supports students whose speech may be difficult to parse, and it lets them have their responses fairly and fully scored. So this is an example of an accommodation that originated in a school and then was brought up through a state into ALPA 21 and is now part of our accommodations manual. I mention this because as we bring out alternate ELP assessments, accommodations like this will become even more prevalent and even more important to consider. So keeping these practical considerations in mind when making participation and assessment decisions will help to include all students in assessment, both fairly and intentionally. Last piece of practical advice is to make resources readily available. So at ALPA 21, we continually update our resources on our website, and so does Iowa. Jennifer is going to talk to you about Iowa's IEP process and their philosophy around students with disabilities. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Cass. So my name is Jennifer Den, and I'm the alternate assessment consultant for the Iowa Department of Education. And I'm going to share with you just a little bit of information today on Iowa and our special education system. I'm excited to say that historically, Iowa has been under the 1% threshold for students taking our alternate assessment. And we feel that possibly the way we categorize might have something to do with that. We are looking at, in Iowa, at a non-categorical system, and that all of our students who require special education services are considered eligible individuals. We have intermediate agencies that we call area education agencies across the state that help districts and IEP teams make those eligibility determinations. And all students are classified as eligible individuals. In Iowa, a child with a disability is referred to, we abbreviated as an EI, rather than a particular label. And this is because labels by themselves don't provide parents or educators the information that is necessary regarding instructional needs. This is also may be a bias for inappropriately restrictive placement decisions. So just because a student has a specific disability category wouldn't necessarily mean that their instruction needs to look like another student's with that same disability label. So while we don't require the use of disability-specific labels, the use of the IE label doesn't exempt a team from determining whether a child is included in one of the IDEA's disability categories. So then moving on, looking at IDEA's definition of a disability, the physical or mental condition, this term is purposefully broad and encompasses any impairment or diagnosis of any kind that might have an adverse effect on educational performance and might require special education services for a student. And when we're considering whether a physical or mental condition adversely affects educational performance, teams need to consider the child's progress and discrepancy in relationship to 4 different things. So the first is access to the general education setting and opportunities. They need to consider developmental progress, the involvement and progress in the general curriculum, and interpersonal relationships or personal adjustments. And really want to stress that educational performance is broader than proficiency in reading and in mathematics. And if a child does not have a physical or mental condition or a condition that does not adversely affect the child's performance, the child would not have a disability under these standards and would not be eligible for special education services. Okay, and I want to go over just a little bit of our alternate assessment participation guidelines. So the following on this slide and the next one are the reasons that are not allowable or not accessible considerations for determining participation in Iowa's alternate assessment. And specifically looking at number 3, one of the things that we are focusing on in Iowa as we are redoing our IEP system that we are hoping to be ready and have all rolled out for the 21-22 school year is that we are really including information in there for IEP teams to include a person that is familiar with language acquisition for teams, for students that do not have English as their first language. So like I said, we're really looking at making sure we have a broad range of people who know all about the student involved in those IEP processes. And then here we're just going to finish off our list of participation things that can't be used to make that determination. Okay, so we really only focus on 3 questions as we are determining participation in our alternate assessments. And that would be, does the student have a significant cognitive disability? And we're reviewing student records. We don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis of that to have a student be able to qualify for that. The second one is that the student receives instruction on the Iowa Core Essential Elements, which are aligned to our Iowa Core standards, but are of reduced breadth, depth, and complexity. And the third one is that the student requires extensive, direct, individualized instruction that substantially supports to achieve measurable gains in the grade and age-appropriate curriculum. So I am going to hand it back to Kat.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm going to briefly talk to you about the alternate ELP assessment that we're developing between Iowa and Alpha 21. In the 2019 CGSA program with the Department of Education, Iowa was awarded $7,007,650 to develop alternate summative ELP assessment for English learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So these are students that typically were unable to take the regular ELP assessment or who could not fully participate in that assessment because they couldn't be fully accommodated or included. So this grant project is being led by Iowa in collaboration with ELPA 21. We have the ELPA 21 states, and then 3 independent states have joined this work. And our first operational assessment is scheduled to be available in school year 22-23. This will be an ELP summative assessment on alternate ELP standards. So the goals of the project are to develop that alternate summative assessment of English language proficiency. It's based on alternate performance expectations, which are the CCSSO ELP standards for students who are English learners with the most significant disabilities, the most significant cognitive disabilities. So those are the standards that we're using. Those standards were developed by about 20 states over the past few years, and that project was led by CCSSO. The second goal of the CELP project with Iowa is to develop resident professional learning about the standards, instruction, and the assessment of English learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And then the third goal is to develop and launch a sustainable program to maintain the assessment and practices. So this work is underway, and as I mentioned, we will have an operational assessment available in school year 22-23. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you today, and we would love to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Pat and Jennifer.
I don't see any questions in the chat box. If anyone has any, please go ahead and type them in.
We have someone typing, so I'll hold on a minute. All right, looks like it's taking a minute to get the question up. Since I don't see that question yet, I think that you can continue to type. We can come back to questions at the end of this next presentation, but I'd like to turn it over to Lorene Christensen and Jennifer Voorhees from the WIDA Consortium to be our next set of presenters. Lorene and Jennifer?
I'm not sure if Lorene is having trouble with her audio or not, so this is Jennifer Voorhees.
Christy, can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
Great. Sorry about that. There was a little technical difficulty, but I'm here now. So I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about our participation and accommodations at WIDA. I am an assessment researcher, and I'm here with my colleague, Jennifer Voorhees, and I am happy to just jump right in. Just a little bit of background on WIDA. We're located at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we provide a comprehensive approach to supporting academic language development for all English learners, including English learners who have disabilities. We develop standards, assessments, we have research projects, and ongoing professional learning. Our resources are used in 42 domestic states, territories, and federal agencies, and we also have our assessments in 500 international schools. So just really quickly, here's a little map showing where we're at. And then just briefly about our assessments. We have screeners, we have our primary assessment access for ELLs, we also have a kindergarten access, our alternate access, which I'll tell you a little bit more at the end of the presentation, and then we offer both large print formats and Braille formats.
We also wanted to tell you some information about our assessment by the numbers. So in the 2018-19 school year, we administered over 2 million administrations of access-free LLs. That included approximately 250,000 students with IEPs and 504 plans. We had 23,000 plus administrations of alternate access. And then we also had about 266 administrations in Braille and almost 1,000 administrations of our large print assessment. I wanted to touch on screeners a little bit because I know that we've been having quite a riveting conversation in the chat related to identification. We do have a number of screeners, as you can see here. Our primary screeners are the WIDA screener online and in paper. We currently still use our WAPT for kindergarten, although we are in development of a WIDA screener for kindergarten that will be operational next year. We also, for this school year, developed a remote screener. So this is a tool that can be used when students aren't able to go into testing buildings. And then we're currently working on developing a screener related to our students who take the alternate assessment. So these questions that have been coming up in the chat, I think about the screening of students, especially those in grades K through 2, is really critically important because we know that while many students in this population who would be kids taking an alternate assessment are identified as having a significant cognitive disability before they come to school, we know that other students, there's a small population of those students who it may be less clear. So we're definitely thinking about our alternate screener and how that interfaces both with our other screeners as well as just the general identification process for English learners. So with this background on WIDA, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jennifer, who will tell you a little bit more about our participation and accommodations guidelines.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. So I'm going to talk about our how we decide which assessment students are going to take once they've already had a screener, they're already identified as an English learner, it's already known whether they're a student who takes an alternate assessment or does not take an alternate assessment, and now we need to determine whether they'll be taking our alternate access, which is our assessment for students who need an alternate assessment, or the access. And one of the ways that we have is that we do this is we have a participation decision tree that schools can use and the IEP team can use to determine whether the student needs to take the alternate access. And in doing this first, they need to be an English learner. They need to have a significant cognitive disability. And then it's looking at the type of instruction that they're receiving, extensive instruction, that they need a lot of substantial adaptations to their instruction, and that they, in order to be able to progress on the grade level and age level curriculum, that they are using an alternative curriculum, and that they are participating or will participate in their state's alternate content assessment. And this is, of course, in grades 3 and up, there is the alternate assessment. Prior to that, we do know that in K to 2, there are no content assessments, so it's what would happen in the state. And then we're also looking at what we need to do for this level of K to 2nd grade in helping states to be able to, or schools to be able to make better decisions for these students. And if they're able to answer all of these questions with yes, then they're eligible for our alternate access assessment. If they are not, then they would take our access assessment, which I'll talk a little bit about next. So in the access assessment, we have an accommodation policy that actually works with all of our assessments that we've designed. That we first base all of our assessments when we created them using universal design principles. so that they're as accessible as possible. Then, for all English learners, not just students who have disabilities, but we know all English learners may need some types of accommodation, not actual accommodations that are for students with disabilities, but something that some things that may be different than just the standard. So we have administrative considerations that may be used with students. And then built within our assessments, we also have universal tools which are available to all English learners who are taking our assessment. Finally, at the apex of our pyramid, we have the accommodations, and these are only for students who have either an IEP or a 504 plan that is saying that the student needs this accommodation because of the disability that they have and that this is within their plan. So looking at our administrative considerations, we have a variety of administrative considerations that can be used with students. It's not necessary that every student receives every single one of these, but this allows the test administrator to make decisions that are best for each individual student taking the test to ensure that the student is best able to show what they are capable of doing in English. So some of these administrative considerations include things like adaptive and specialized equipment or furniture that the student might be using. So if they're using standing desks, or if they're using a certain type of microphone instead of the headset that we do for our listening test. So just a variety of things like that. Alternative microphones. Familiar test administrator, somebody the student knows so that it relieves that anxiety that students sometimes face when they are in an assessment. Being able to add some additional breaks that are supervised during the assessment if that's needed, determining whether a student needs a smaller or larger group, or even just making sure the student is responding where they're supposed to, whether it is in the paper test booklet for our paper version of our Access for ELL, or in the computer version that they're selecting the correct place to put their response. Because we have both a paper version and an online version, sometimes an administrative consideration is that the student might be tested in a different format than what is typically offered. So, for example, a student who just moved to the United States, came from a country where they didn't have a lot of computer access, might be in a state that typically tests online, and that this student might need a paper version, at least initially, and that is something that can be chosen for all students who are taking this. Allowing students to read aloud to themselves, having specific seating, shortened segments of information, praising the student and redirecting as needed, are all things that can happen for all English learners who are taking our assessment. Then we have universal tools. Our universal tools are tools that students may choose to use when they are taking the assessment. These tools are available both online, in our online platform, and there's comparable tools that are available in the paper version of our assessment as well. With these universal tools, students are able to practice what these tools look like prior to the day of the assessment using the practice items and sample items that we have available. These tools include things like audio aids for being able to increase volume, changing the color contrast or color overlay, having a highlighter or like a keyboard navigation, a line guide so they can see where they are, magnifying, and scratch paper and sticky notes. And then for students with a documented disability who have an IEP or a 504 plan and need an accommodation, we have a variety of accommodations available. Some of them include special formats of our test. For example, we have a Braille format of our test, as Lorraine had said earlier. We also have a large print version of our assessment that provided the assessment in another context that the student can better be able to use. Then we have different extended test period, test times, extended speaking time, or extending a test over multiple days. We have a couple of different ways of having a human reader read certain items. So if a student has a disability that made it difficult for them to decode text, that for certain domains they're able to have somebody read what is on the assessment so that they're not being hindered by the disability. And having interpreters sign directions in ASL, not taking the test in ASL, but having the directions signed to them. Repeating items, being able to control when the item starts. So also being able to have a scribe to record answers. Allowing the student when writing to record their response on a device first, and then they play it back and they transcribe their own answer. And also taking it in a non-school setting, or providing a keyboard or another type of word processing device so that they can respond when writing, or a variety of our accommodations. And now Lorene is going to talk a little bit more about some of our ongoing research that we have.
Thanks, Jen. And I also just wanted to mention some additional support we have for states as well. So as we're thinking about peer review, for example, and making sure that states have all of the resources that they need, we are developing some tools to help with monitoring accommodations as well as accommodation selection. And then we are doing ongoing research. So some things that we've been working on already include an analysis of the less than 4 domains. So for students who may have difficulty accessing one or more domains on the assessment, we've developed approaches to creating overall composite scores for those students. And one of our colleagues at WIDA has been doing a number of research projects related to that. We've also investigated our universal tools. So those are all embedded, and we are lucky enough to be able to collect the telemetry data from the use of the universal tools. And so we've been able to do an investigation of how students interact with those tools, because those are available to both students with and without IEPs, we've been able to look at that sort of comparatively. And then we've also been doing some ongoing research related to long-term ELs. In looking across 15 of our WIDA states, we've been able to sort of do some analysis of what's going on with our students who stay in English programs for more than 5 years. Additional research that we have that's going on currently is we're looking at home language surveys across all 50 states and their interpretations. We're particularly interested in this with regard to thinking about how the home language survey is really the starting off point for EL identification and how it relates to the work that we're doing in developing an alternate screener. We've got some research projects that are in the early development stages related to efficacy and use of accommodations. And then we also are conducting a secondary analysis on a tool called the Individual Characteristics Questionnaire. So this tool was developed from the Altella grant from a few years ago, where we were able to gather characteristic information from 1,578 students, and we're now doing a secondary analysis to look at some patterns that emerge related to disability category. So those are some ongoing things that we have. And I also just wanted to mention in closing that we are also underway with the Advancing Altella project, and we are thankful to be partnering with Minnesota as the lead state in this work, and grateful to the leadership of Tracy Montez Lindner and Don Cameron, who I know are on this call. And we have, as Don mentioned at the beginning of the call, a plan to really revise and update the alternate access, but we are also developing the alternate screener in this work, and then some professional learning materials and ongoing research to support the update of alternate access.
So I think that we have a lot of really exciting things going on at WIDA, and we're happy to have this opportunity to share this all with you. And then I also just want to, in closing, mention that we are, you can check out our website. We've also started some educator resource groups on Facebook, and so it's a great opportunity for people, especially in this current age with everybody being remote, to have some opportunity to build community and get support as we navigate these really uncertain times. So I just want to thank everyone for this opportunity today, and I'll turn it back to you, Christy.
Thank you. Cheryl, any questions?
No questions. If there's any final questions, type them in the chat box.
That could be questions for our WIDA colleagues or just in general on this whole topic. Not seeing anything get started. While people are thinking of whether they have questions, I just want to remind you that there is an evaluation, a really short one. It's also pasted in the chat as well to give us some feedback on this webinar and help us plan for future events. So if you would go to the survey and complete it after you hop off the call, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for your participation in this webinar today. It was really informative and helpful to hear all these different approaches to including English learners with disabilities in assessment participation and accommodations decisions. Thank you all. Thank you to the department. Cheryl, any additional things you'd like to add from NCEO?
I don't have anything additional, and I'd just like to thank all of the presenters and thank Christy for organizing this one.
Don and Deborah, any last words? I'm thinking they're on mute. We still have a discussion going in the chat, but I believe that's all for today. Thank you all for coming. And we look forward to hearing from you or seeing you soon. Take care.